According to the position of global sighting, if the moon is validly sighted anywhere in the world, then this sighting is binding for Muslims all over the world to follow. This is the position of the majority of Islamic scholarship. This is actually the position of the Hanafi, the Maliki, and a large part of the Hanbali school. This is the majority position in Islamic scholarship, the position of global sighting. According to this position, if the moon is validly sighted anywhere in the world, then this sighting, if it's established, becomes binding on Muslims everywhere else to follow. The question arises, what if a sighting is reported before the moon is even born, as sometimes happens today? If we refer back to our lesson on the science of moon sighting, where we studied the phases of the moon, we learned in that lesson that the new moon is the beginning of the cycle. And when the moon is new, it's not sightable because it's in a straight line in between the earth and the sun, and the dark side of the moon is facing the earth, and so the moon will not be visible from the earth. And the moon only becomes visible after this. So if the moon is sighted or reported to be sighted before it's even born, then this report would not be permissible to act on, because we know for certain that the report is a mistaken report. The one who reported to see the moon undoubtedly did not see it. So we only follow the position of global sighting when the sighting is actually sightable, when it's not a mistake. This is the position of global sighting that is the majority position in Islamic scholarship. Let's move on to the position of regional sighting. According to the position of regional sighting, if the moon is sighted in one region, for example, in Northwest Africa, region A, then this sighting is not binding on a region that is far away, such as in the Arabian Peninsula, region B. This position is the position of the Shafi'i school. According to the Shafi'i school, the sighting of one region is not binding on the sighting of another region. Each region goes by its local sighting. Here, the question arises, if we want to implement this opinion, how far is far? How far before a region becomes a different region? And in order to understand the answer to this question, we need to examine the longitudinal distance. So this is a diagram of the earth with the lines of longitude drawn on it. According to the late scholars of the Shafi'i school, the distance that determines whether a region is the same region or a different region is a longitudinal distance of 8 degrees. So if there is a sighting in location A, then this sighting in location A will be binding on location B if it falls within 8 degrees longitudinal distance from A. But if location B is more than 8 degrees longitudinal distance away, then the sighting of location A will not be binding on location B to follow. Now, this longitudinal distance at the equator comes to about 890 kilometers, and you can work that out yourself by multiplying the circumference of the earth by 8 longitudinal distance, 8 degrees over 360 degrees. This comes to about 890 kilometers, and this will vary as you move away from the equator. But the important thing is the longitudinal distance of 8 degrees. Now, there's a small point to note here, which is that according to Imam Taqiyuddin as-Subki, a major figure in the Shafi'i school, if there is a sighting in the east, then this sighting is binding in the west, regardless of distance, even if it's more than 8 degrees away. And the reason for this is that night in the west comes after night in the east. So if the moon is sighted in the east, then it will inevitably be sighted in the west, because the moon will grow and it will be larger in the west than it was in the east. So a sighting in the east is binding in the west regardless of distance, but a sighting in the west is not binding in the east if it's far away, more than 8 degrees away. And this position was strengthened by many of the late scholars of the Shafi'i school, and it corresponds to the way that we now know that things work. So if we understand this, this means that for Muslims living, for example, in North America, the sightings in the Muslim world, we can't apply the position of regional sighting, because a sighting in the Muslim world in the east, if it's a valid sighting, will be binding in the Muslims in the west to follow. Although there are details here that are discussed in an article that I have written on this topic. Let's now examine the position that allows the use of calculations to establish the beginning of the month of Ramadan. This is the position of Imam Muhammad al-Ramli of the Shafi'i school. Imam Muhammad al-Ramli, along with Imam Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, represents the foremost reference for fatwa in the Shafi'i school. He is an authority in the Shafi'i school. According to Imam al-Ramli, an astronomer who believes that the new moon exists, he doesn't actually have to see it. As long as he believes that the new moon exists based on his calculations, he is required to fast. He must fast. For him, Ramadan has begun. As is anyone who believes him. Anyone who believes, based on the astronomer's calculations, that the new moon exists is also obliged to fast. Note here that it's not a condition that he actually sight the moon. Sighting is not required. Sighting is not required according to this position to establish Ramadan. What matters is that the moon actually exists, even if it's not sighted, even if it's not sightable. It doesn't even have to be sightable. So how do we practically implement this position in our lives? If we want to implement this position, then we look for two things. We look for the fact that the moon has been born. If the moon has been born, that means that it is in a straight line in between the sun and the earth. So if the moon has been born and moonset is after sunset, what does it mean for the moon to set? For the moon to set means that it goes below the horizon. So if the moon goes below the horizon after sunset, this means that it was there above the horizon for a time after sunset. It was there. In other words, the moon existed on the horizon during this night. And that is sufficient to establish the beginning of the month of Ramadan. Just to clarify this, let's examine a diagram that we saw in our lesson on the science of moon sighting. When the moon is born, it's aligned like this in between the earth and the sun. If this is you standing on the earth just after sunset, looking up at the moon will be invisible. It will not be sightable, because the dark side of the moon is facing you. And the moon does not emit any lights of its own. When we see the light of the moon, it's the light that's reflected, that it reflects from the sun. So here, the moon is not sightable, but if an astronomer knows based on his calculations that the moon is there, and it hasn't gone below the horizon after sunset, then based on that, for him, the month of Ramadan has begun as has the month of Ramadan begun for anyone who believes him. So that the moon be sightable is not a condition. All that matters is that the moon actually exists.